George Orwell wrote in 1984 about the memory hole, a chute in the Ministry of Truth where inconvenient documents were dropped to be destroyed, erasing events from the historical record so the party could rewrite the past to serve present needs. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. This wasn't just dystopian fiction. It's how institutions actually operate. The IMF's 2010 report predicting Greek austerity would restore growth within 2 years has been removed from public access. The World Bank's 1990s projections that structural adjustment would develop Africa are archived offline, where researchers cannot access them. Think tanks delete articles making predictions that proved catastrophically wrong. Government agencies heavily redact documents that would reveal how bad intelligence produced disastrous policies. The institutional memory hole isn't Orwellian metaphor. It's standard practice. Institutions delete their failures, archive their mistakes, and ensure that the documentary record emphasizes successes while making failures difficult to find. This matters because institutions repeat the same mistakes, specifically because they've erased evidence of previous failures. The memory hole doesn't just rewrite history, it prevents learning from it. And in the digital age, when everything should be permanently archived and instantly accessible, the institutional memory hole operates more efficiently than ever. Understanding how the memory hole functions requires examining specific cases where institutions erased their failures, why they do it, and what happens when institutional memory is deliberately destroyed. The IMF's handling of the Greek financial crisis provides the clearest example of institutional memory holing in recent history. In 2010, Greece faced sovereign debt crisis, requiring external financing to avoid default. The IMF, European Central Bank, and European Commission, the Troika, provided bailout financing contingent on austerity measures, spending cuts, tax increases, pension reductions, privatizations, and labor market reforms. The program was harsh, but IMF economists predicted it would work quickly. The IMF's 2010 projections were specific and confident. The program would contract Greek GDP by approximately 5% over 2 years, then restore growth by 2012. Unemployment would peak around 15%, then decline as reforms improved competitiveness. The debt-to-GDP ratio would stabilize and begin declining by 2013. Greece would return to bond markets by 2014. The projections weren't presented as uncertain. They were presented as rigorous analysis showing that painful but temporary adjustment would restore sustainability. The IMF's formal documents were even more specific. The May 2010 standby arrangement projected Greek GDP growth would return to positive territory by 2012, reaching 1.1% annual growth. The primary fiscal balance would reach surplus of 3.5% of GDP by 2013. Structural reforms would improve competitiveness by 10% over 3 years. Government debt would peak at 150% of GDP in 2013, then decline steadily. These weren't ranges or scenarios. They were point estimates presented as the expected outcome from IMF-designed policies. The internal IMF documents obtained later through the Independent Evaluation Office review revealed even more confidence. IMF staff papers from 2010 acknowledged uncertainty, but concluded that program design is appropriate and outcomes are likely to be achieved if Greece implements reforms as agreed. The confidence permeated the institution, despite dissenting voices within IMF research departments who questioned whether fiscal multipliers were properly estimated. The actual outcomes were catastrophic. Greek GDP contracted not 5% but over 25% through 2016. Unemployment didn't peak at 15%, it exceeded 27%. Youth unemployment reached 60%. The debt-to-GDP ratio didn't stabilize. It exploded from 130% to over 180%. Greece didn't return to bond markets in 2014. It required additional bailouts in 2012 and 2015. The austerity program that was supposed to last 2 years continued for nearly a decade. The projections weren't just wrong. They were wrong by factors of 2 to 5 across every metric. In 2013, the IMF's Independent Evaluation Office reviewed the Greek program and concluded that the initial projections had been unrealistically optimistic, that fiscal multipliers were underestimated, and that the program design was flawed. This was remarkable admission for an institution that rarely acknowledges error. But what's more remarkable is what happened to the original 2010 documents. Researchers attempting to access the IMF's original 2010 Greek program documents found them removed from public sections of the IMF website. The documents were reclassified as internal review materials requiring special permission to access. The IMF didn't deny the documents existed, they just made them effectively inaccessible to public scrutiny. The projections that proved catastrophically wrong were memory hold, while current IMF documents emphasized lessons learned without providing easy access to the original failures. This matters because the IMF continues implementing similar programs in other countries. Pakistan, Argentina, Egypt, and others face IMF conditionality based on similar economic logic. Austerity restores competitiveness and growth. Researchers trying to evaluate whether IMF programs work cannot easily access the IMF's own projections for past programs to compare against actual outcomes. The institutional memory emphasizes successes and buries failures. The World Bank's handling of African structural adjustment programs follows identical patterns. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the World Bank promoted structural adjustment across Africa, privatization of state enterprises, removal of subsidies, trade liberalization, currency devaluation, and reduced government spending. The theory was that removing government intervention would unleash private sector growth and development. The World Bank's projections were optimistic. African economies would grow at 5 to 7% annually after adjustment. Poverty would decline as growth created employment. Export competitiveness would improve from currency devaluation and trade openness. Government finances would stabilize from spending discipline. The programs would be difficult for several years, but would transform African economies into dynamic emerging markets by 2000. The outcomes were opposite. Most African economies that implemented structural adjustment grew slower in the 1990s than in the 1970s before adjustment. Per capita income in many countries was lower in 2000 than in 1990. Poverty increased as government services collapsed faster than private sector employment expanded. Manufacturing sectors shrank as trade liberalization exposed them to competition they couldn't survive. The debt crisis worsened as currencies devalued made foreign debt repayment more expensive. The World Bank eventually acknowledged that structural adjustment hadn't delivered projected outcomes. But try finding the World Bank's 1990-1995 projections for specific African countries. The documents are in legacy archives that aren't digitized and aren't available through the World Bank's online document system. Researchers must submit formal requests and often face months-long delays or outright refusals based on institutional confidentiality policies. This isn't because the documents are classified for security reasons. They're simply inconvenient. They show the World Bank making confident predictions that proved completely wrong, implementing programs that worsened the problems they were supposed to solve, and never being held accountable because the documentary evidence is inaccessible. The World Bank's current Africa strategy documents reference lessons learned from the past, but don't provide easy access to the past projections that failed. The memory hole protects institutional reputation at the expense of institutional learning. The Pentagon's Iraq weapons of mass destruction intelligence provides a government equivalent. In 2002-2003, U.S. intelligence agencies assessed that Iraq possessed chemical and biological weapons and was reconstituting nuclear weapons programs. These assessments, presented as high-confidence conclusions based on solid intelligence, provided the primary justification for the 2003 invasion. The assessments were wrong. Iraq had no active WMD programs. The aluminum tubes weren't for centrifuges. The mobile biological labs didn't exist. The uranium from Niger was forged documents. The intelligence that justified the war was comprehensively wrong on every major claim. Subsequent investigations revealed that intelligence was shaped by policy preferences, that dissenting analysis was suppressed, and that uncertainty was removed from assessments presented to policymakers. But accessing the original 2002-2003 intelligence assessments is extraordinarily difficult. The documents were declassified years later, but with such heavy redaction that understanding how the intelligence community reached wrong conclusions is impossible. The sections explaining sourcing, confidence levels, dissenting views, and analytical methodology are blacked out. Researchers can see the conclusions but cannot evaluate the reasoning that produced them. This matters because the same intelligence agencies continue producing assessments that shape policy. Understanding how intelligence failed on Iraq is essential for evaluating current intelligence on Iran, China, Russia, or other adversaries. But if the documentary record of failure is redacted into illegibility, learning from the failure becomes impossible. The memory hole ensures that institutional failures don't undermine institutional authority, even when those failures had catastrophic consequences. Think tanks and policy research organizations operate the most efficient memory holes because they're not subject to freedom of information requirements. When predictions prove wrong, articles simply disappear from websites. The Council on Foreign Relations published multiple articles in 2011 predicting the Arab Spring would bring democracy to the Middle East. Libya would stabilize as a functioning state. Syria would transition peacefully. Egypt would build democratic institutions. The predictions were completely wrong. Libya collapsed into failed state. Syria descended into civil war. Egypt had military coup. The Arab Spring produced chaos, authoritarianism, and regional instability, exactly opposite of predictions. Try finding those 2011 CFR articles on the CFR website. They're gone. They exist in Internet Archive Wayback Machine, but they've been removed from CFR's own site. The institutional memory emphasizes CFR's successful predictions while deleting failed ones. This isn't unique to CFR. The Atlantic Council, Brookings Institution, Heritage Foundation, Center for Strategic and International Studies, every major think tank has scrubbed wrong predictions from their websites. Articles predicting Russia would democratize, China would liberalize, Iraq would stabilize, Afghanistan would build democratic institutions, all memory hold. The think tank experts who made catastrophically wrong predictions continue being quoted as authorities because their failures have been deleted from the accessible record. The academic dimension shows how institutional memory holes operate in supposedly objective research. Pharmaceutical companies fund clinical trials testing drug effectiveness and safety. Trials showing positive results get published in medical journals. Trials showing negative results or harmful side effects often don't get published at all. This publication bias means the medical literature overemphasizes evidence supporting pharmaceutical effectiveness while underemphasizing evidence of harm. Researchers have documented this extensively. Pharmaceutical companies legally don't have to publish negative trial results. Journals prefer publishing positive findings that make news over null results that don't. The result is that meta-analyses attempting to evaluate drug effectiveness by reviewing published literature systematically overestimate benefits and underestimate harms because negative evidence has been memory-holed through non-publication. The antidepressant literature provides stark examples. Researchers gained access to FDA files containing all clinical trials submitted for drug approval, both published and unpublished. They found that 94% of positive trials were published in journals, while only 14% of negative trials were published. When negative trials were published, they were often written to emphasize positive secondary outcomes rather than reporting the primary outcome failure. The published literature made antidepressants appear twice as effective as the complete trial data showed. The Vioxx case revealed more sinister dynamics. Merck conducted trials showing Vioxx increased heart attack and stroke risk, but delayed publishing those results while emphasizing pain relief benefits in published studies. When cardiovascular risks became undeniable, Merck withdrew Vioxx from market in 2004. Congressional investigations revealed internal Merck documents showing the company knew about cardiovascular risks years before withdrawal, but had memory hold that evidence through non-publication and selective emphasis. This matters because doctors make treatment decisions based on published literature. If the literature systematically excludes negative evidence, doctors prescribe medications believing them safer and more effective than the complete evidence would support. The memory hole operates through selective publication rather than deleting documents, but the effect is identical. Inconvenient evidence disappears from the accessible record. The financial crisis of 2008 produced extensive institutional memory holing. Major banks and rating agencies made confidently wrong predictions about mortgage-backed securities and collateralized debt obligations. Internal documents showed analysts knew the securities were riskier than ratings suggested, but accessing those internal documents required lawsuits and regulatory investigations. The institutions themselves certainly weren't making the documents public. When congressional investigations demanded documents, financial institutions provided them but heavily redacted. The sections showing what executives knew and when they knew it were blacked out as proprietary business information. Understanding how institutions that were supposed to evaluate risk failed so completely became impossible because the documentary evidence was inaccessible. The memory hole protected institutions from accountability for failures that nearly collapsed the global economy. The climate science dimension reveals memory hole dynamics in reverse. Early oil company research from the 1970s-1980s accurately predicted climate change from fossil fuel emissions. Exxon's own scientists produced sophisticated climate models, showing the greenhouse effect would warm the planet. These internal documents were memory holed, not destroyed but archived where public access was impossible. When the documents eventually emerged through investigative journalism and legal discovery, they revealed that oil companies knew about climate change decades before publicly acknowledging it. The documents showed corporations making strategic decisions to fund climate denial, while their own scientists confirmed the science. The memory hole operated to hide knowledge rather than failure, but the mechanism was identical: make inconvenient documents inaccessible. The digital age should make institutional memory holes impossible. Everything is archived. Websites are captured by Internet Archive. Documents are scanned and digitized. Deletion should be impossible when everything exists in multiple copies across the Internet. But digital technology makes memory holes more efficient, not less. Organizations control their own websites and can remove content at will. The Internet Archive captures websites periodically but not continuously. Documents removed between archive crawls disappear. PDFs can be replaced with redacted versions using identical file names so links don't break, but content changes. Paywalls and access restrictions make documents technically accessible but practically inaccessible to most researchers. The technical mechanisms are sophisticated. WebRobots.txt files can instruct search engines and archives not to crawl specific pages. This makes content invisible to Google and Internet Archive while remaining technically public. The HTTP 410 status code tells search engines a page is gone permanently and should be removed from indexes. Organizations can use this to deliberately erase content from search results without actually deleting it from servers. The PDF metadata manipulation is particularly insidious. Organizations publish reports with specific file names. Researchers cite those PDFs using the URLs. Years later, the organization uploads a new PDF with identical file name, but revised content at the same URL. All the citations now point to the revised version. The original version only exists if someone downloaded it before replacement. The organization can claim they updated the document for corrections, while actually memory holing inconvenient content. The paywall strategy makes documents technically public while practically inaccessible. Academic journal articles are published but cost $30–50 per article to access. Research reports are publicly available but require expensive subscriptions. The documents exist in the public record technically, but 99% of potential readers cannot afford access. The memory hole operates through price rather than deletion. More insidiously, search engine optimization and web design can make documents technically public but effectively invisible. Place a document in a subsection of a website that search engines don't index. Require knowing the exact URL to access it. Make the title generic so searching for the content doesn't find it. The document is public but cannot be found. The memory hole operates through obscurity rather than deletion. The platform economy amplifies this. Most institutional communication now happens on social media platforms that institutions control. Delete a tweet and it's gone instantly across the entire platform. Edit a Facebook post and the original disappears. No archive exists unless someone specifically captured it before deletion. Institutional communication that would have been preserved in press releases, memos, and official statements now exists in ephemeral social media posts that can be memory holed instantly. The consequence is that institutions repeat mistakes specifically because institutional memory of previous failures has been erased. The IMF implements austerity programs similar to Greece's failed program because access to Greece's failed projections is difficult. The World Bank promotes structural reforms similar to Africa's failed adjustments because the failed projections are archived offline. Intelligence agencies shape assessments to support policy preferences like they did on Iraq, because the Iraq failure documentation is heavily redacted. Think tanks confidently predict outcomes like they wrongly predicted Arab Spring democracy because their wrong predictions have been deleted. The pattern is consistent. Make confident predictions, implement policies based on those predictions. Fail catastrophically. Memory hole the failed predictions. Repeat with new confident predictions. The cycle continues because institutional accountability requires institutional memory, and institutional memory is deliberately destroyed to protect institutional authority. The solution seems obvious. Require institutions to maintain complete, publicly accessible archives of all predictions, projections, and policy documents. Make deletion illegal. Mandate that all institutional publications remain permanently accessible. Create independent archives that preserve institutional documents regardless of whether institutions want them preserved. But institutions resist precisely because accountability is the problem. The IMF doesn't want researchers easily accessing decades of failed projections, because that would undermine IMF authority. The World Bank doesn't want African economists comparing bank projections to actual outcomes, because the bank would be shown to have consistently made wrong predictions. Think tanks don't want wrong predictions accessible because their credibility depends on appearing prophetic rather than acknowledging frequent failure. The memory hole persists because institutions benefit from it more than they suffer from repeating mistakes. An institution that memory holes failures and emphasizes successes maintains authority and continues receiving funding, influence, and respect. An institution that maintains complete accessible archives of predictions and allows constant evaluation against outcomes faces accountability that threatens authority. From the institution's perspective, the memory hole is rational even though it prevents learning. The strategic question is whether external forces can impose memory preservation on institutions that benefit from memory holes. Can regulations require permanent public archives? Can researchers create independent archives capturing institutional documents before they're deleted? Can digital technology make deletion impossible by distributing copies so widely that institutional control becomes futile? The answer is unclear because the technological capability exists, but the political will doesn't. We could require permanent institutional archives. We could fund independent organizations that capture and preserve institutional documents. We could mandate transparency that makes memory holes illegal. But doing so requires acknowledging that respected institutions systematically erase their failures, and that acknowledgement itself threatens the institutional authority that makes the system function. The regulatory options exist but face implementation challenges. The Freedom of Information Act in the United States requires government agencies to preserve and provide access to documents. But FOIA has enormous loopholes, national security exemptions, deliberative process privileges, personal privacy protections that agencies use to withhold or heavily redact documents. Extending FOIA-like requirements to international institutions like IMF or private organizations like think tanks faces jurisdictional and sovereignty problems. The European Union's transparency regulations are more aggressive than American equivalents, requiring EU institutions to maintain public document registries. But the regulations apply only to EU institutions, not international organizations headquartered in Europe. And even EU institutions use classifications like internal review or policy deliberation to restrict access to sensitive documents. The regulations exist, but enforcement depends on political will that fluctuates with leadership changes. The independent archive solution shows promise but faces resource constraints. Organizations like Internet Archive, WikiLeaks, and Document Cloud attempt to preserve institutional documents independently of institutional control. But they depend on someone providing documents before institutions delete them. The Wayback Machine captures websites, but misses documents published between crawls or behind authentication requirements. Whistleblowers provide internal documents, but face prosecution and retaliation that deters others. The distributed technology solution leverages blockchain and decentralized storage to make deletion impossible once documents are published. Once data is distributed across thousands of nodes in decentralized systems, no single institution can delete it. Researchers have proposed using blockchain to create permanent institutional archives where documents published cannot be removed even by institutions that publish them. The technology works, but institutions won't voluntarily adopt systems that prevent memory holding failures. So the memory hole persists and expands in the digital age. Institutions continue making confident predictions, implementing policies based on those predictions, failing catastrophically, memory holing the failed predictions, and repeating with new confident predictions. The cycle is predictable. The outcomes are consistent. And the pattern continues specifically because institutional memory of previous failures has been carefully erased from the accessible record. Orwell's Ministry of Truth isn't dystopian fiction. It's standard institutional practice, operating more efficiently today than Orwell could have imagined when everything is digital and deletion is instantaneous.